Since the inception of the armed services, there have been special operations soldiers. The first special ops forces were arguably the carefully chosen Greek warriors who were hidden outside Troy's gates 3,000 years ago, inside the Trojan horse. A distinctive group of frontiersmen known as the Rogers Rangers rose to prominence during the French and Indian War in America, thanks to their unique set of talents and code of behavior, which made them an invaluable weapon in warfare in the middle of the 18th century. The Rangers' legacy lives on in both the U.S. American Special Operations Forces and the Army's Ranger Regiment have evolved over the last 60 years. In November and December 1943, a group of around 3,000 American soldiers trained in the jungles near Deoghar, India. They would serve as a vital link between the early Rangers and modern American Special Operations units during World War II. This group of soldiers, who later became known as Merrill's Marauders, enlisted for Unit Galahad in the China-Burma-India theater. The American volunteers, drawn from U.S., Caribbean, and Pacific commands, trained alongside the core group of Chindits preparing for their next long-range insertion. They were modeled after the British long-range penetration group known as the Chindits, which operated behind Japanese lines in 1943. When the Army called for volunteers for a dangerous and hazardous mission, it promised that the volunteers would be sent to combat for 3 months before being returned to the United States. This pledge would eventually become a point of conflict for the volunteers after being made repeatedly. For tactical flexibility once in the jungle, the unit's 3 battalions were further split up into 6 battle teams. Their commander was Colonel Charles Hunter, who had just been promoted. The red and white combat teams comprised the 1st Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Cole, William Osborne. Lieutenant Cole, Charles Beach's 3rd Battalion, was split into orange and khaki teams, while Lieutenant Cole or George McGee, Jr.'s 2nd Battalion, was split into blue and green teams. In the final weeks of 1943, the 31st Quartermaster Pack Troop contributed 300 mules and 80 mule skinners to the regiment. The mortars and other heavy weapons required to maintain combat capability once in the forest, without tracks, had to be carried by mules. Lieutenant General Joseph Stilwell, the American commander in the China-Burma-India theater, campaigned for the force to be put under his command, and he succeeded, even though the original plan called for Brigadier Ord Wingate, the British Chindit leader, to command it. The detachment was renamed the 5307th Composite Unit, Provisional, on January 1, 1944. Colonel Hunter was demoted to the position of deputy to the new commanding commander, Brig. General Frank Merrill, a pipe-smoking, bespectacled man who had been Stilwell's longtime close advisor. The guys of the 5307th were perplexed and disappointed. As the officer in charge of their battalion from the start, Colonel Hunter was well-liked and respected. Prior to the conflict, he had a strong track record as an infantry unit leader and a tactics instructor. In contrast, Brig General Merrill was a staff officer who served as Stilwell's G3, Plans and Operations Officer, and was mostly unknown. Unbeknownst to the guys, Merrill possessed 2 traits that Stilwell valued. He was a trustworthy yes-man and had been a member of Stilwell's inner circle since 1942 and the lengthy trek out of Burma. Stilwell had gathered family members on his staff, as top generals frequently do, designating his son-in-law as his adjutant and his 32-year-old son, Joe, as his G2. Merrill's appointment infuriated many of the men, particularly Colonel Hunter, Merrill's old classmate from West Point, who had assumed command of the battalion. Over the ensuing months, this pervasive sense of unhappiness would only intensify and last long after the war was over. After Stilwell, American reporters went to Deoghar to learn more about this new force. Merrill welcomed them and informed them that his boys were the greatest in the CBI theater. The reporters determined that Merrill's Marauders would be the unit's tag and the moniker under which it would become well known, since it was a more memorable name than 5307th Composite Unit, Provisional, or Unit Galahad. The Marauders started their voyage on January 27th by traveling 1,200 miles by train from the Deoghar camp to Margarita in Assam. They arrived on February 6th, close to the Ledo Road jump-off location. Merrill and Stilwell agreed that the Marauders would walk from India, rather than being airlifted into Burma to strategic locations deep behind the Allied lines, as the Chindits had intended. To get to Stilwell's headquarters at Xinjiang, at the head of the Inkong Valley, this required trudging more than 100 miles along the Lado Road and crossing the 37-27-foot-high Pangzhou Pass over the Patkai Mountains. Merrill justified the Marauders' long march, which ultimately amounted to an estimated 140 miles, by claiming that it would serve as a shakedown or toughening up exercise for the unit. The choice was not well received by the Marauders. Although the Ledo Road construction crews had created a clear dirt road, it was prone to unseasonable rainfall. In order to continue marching day after day, they learned to march lightly packed, and as Merrill had planned, a significant amount of supplementary camp equipment, including tiny cooking stoves, was left behind. In retrospect, this discipline did a great job of preparing them for their actual jungle invasion. On February 7th, the 1st Battalion of the Marauders left Assam to march. The other battalions marched at night to conceal their movements and followed on successive days. They resorted to day marches after it became evident that the secret had been revealed 2 days later when Tokyo Rose greeted them to Burma via radio. The 1st Battalion arrived at Stilwell's old headquarters in Xinjiang on the 18th. Stilwell had relocated his headquarters 25 miles further down the Ledo Road to Ningbian in response to the Chinese division's advance. In order to make a good impression on Stilwell, Merrill had his troops shave and put on their steel helmets before they marched any further on the 19th. But Stilwell was occupied that day, and the Marauders did not come across him until the 21st at Ningbian. By the end of the day, the 3rd Battalion had closed in on the position, while the 2nd Battalion had done so earlier. The first of many successful resupply drops was made possible by the INR, Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon, of the 1st Battalion's Red Team, led by Lieutenant Sam Wilson. They selected an appropriate drop spot and set up the panels for C-47 transport planes. Stillwell was impressed by the Marauders, but it didn't seem to be totally reciprocal because he didn't wear any special uniform pieces or rank insignia. Unaware that it was Stillwell, one of the Marauders was heard calling him a duck hunter. Stillwell, to his credit, simply chuckled. The Marauders at Ningbian welcomed a day off on February 22nd. In the distance, one could hear Japanese artillery firing at the Chinese forces. The stink emanating from neighboring unburied Japanese bodies was equally obvious to certain members of the unit. Merrill was informed by Lieutenant General Stillwell that he intended for the Marauders to use jungle trails to circumnavigate the Japanese fortifications. In order to obstruct the anticipated Japanese retreat, the Marauders would then serve as a maneuver element for the major Chinese attack on Myitkyina, further down the road through the Inkong Valley, and then further on to Walabum. A final air shipment was received on the morning of the 23rd, and Merrill informed his staff. The following morning, under the command of their own INR platoons, the battalions embarked on their assault in Burma via the dim, sometimes indistinguishable jungle pathways. Stillwell's main directive to Merrill was that his soldiers cut the road that led south from Walabum, which was seized by the Japanese 18th Division, who had conquered Singapore by March 3rd. On the main trail, the battalions departed several hours apart, turning off at various locations both toward and beyond the flanks of the Japanese force occupying Walabum. The American recommended 1st Provisional Tank Group and the Chinese 38th Division would strike the Japanese main force in the vicinity of Myitkyina. Once roadblocks were set up to the south, together with positions to the east and west, they would proceed straight toward Walabum, creating a net in which Stillwell intended to trap the Japanese. It is crucial to remember that Stillwell's idea of a long-range penetration group was very different from Ord Wingate's after the raid on Walabum and subsequent Marauders' actions. Major General Wingate intended for the several Chindit units to function autonomously and be dropped far behind enemy lines. Although they would effectively act outside of their support, they would assist the main British soldiers by destroying supply lines and interfering with communications. Although there would be no tactical interaction between the Chindits' planned disruption of the Japanese rear and the British battalions, it would likely generate confusion and maybe divert Japanese troops from the front lines. Stilwell believed that the Marauders should be utilized directly to maximize the attacks of the tank unit he commanded, as well as the two Chinese divisions. In order to obstruct any relief forces and the Japanese departure, they were to maneuver through the forest and around the Japanese forces occupying targets that the Chinese had targeted. Therefore, the Chinese efforts would have a direct impact on the Marauders' positions and the time of their strikes. The battalions might unite when needed to support one another, and although while the Marauders moved independently, their activities would be coordinated with the Chinese. Following Wingate's death in an aircraft accident on March 24th, Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten gave Stilwell command of the Chindits, and the two commanders' divergent perspectives on long-range penetration would prove crucial to the Chindits later in the Allies' 1944 Burma offensive. On the morning of February 24th, however, the Chindits had not yet started to fly in when the Marauders arrived in the Burmese bush. They would not be allowed to board American gliders and C-47s until March 5th. The Walabum Battle. The Marauders set out to circumnavigate the principal Japanese strongholds. Sometimes it was hard to communicate. Stilwell only sometimes refers to the Marauders in his diary, although he keeps a daily tab on the movements of the Chinese battalions. He continued to refer to Merrill as the 5307th, or just M. And at one point, uncertain of the Marauders' whereabouts and Merrill's, he wrote, "Communications would get better later in the campaign, allowing the Marauders to clear unpaved airfields so that L-4 liaison planes with a single engine could arrive and evacuate the wounded." The Marauders' first significant encompassing movement would provide the framework for their later actions. The battalions continued to advance despite encounters with the Japanese, which were essentially squad and platoon operations along the route. Private Robert Landis of Mahoning, Ohio, a Solomon Islands combat veteran, was killed while walking point for an INR platoon in an early engagement, the Marauders' first fatality. The Marauders were able to advance swiftly through the jungle thanks to their discipline and physical strength. Early on March 2nd, the 3rd Battalion covered 18 miles in 11 hours. Merrill radioed Stilwell on March 3rd to inform him that at noon he would have forces in place to block the road south from Walabum. On March 4th, the Marauders would launch an assault on Japanese soldiers as part of a concerted effort by the United States and China to put pressure on enemy positions west, east, and north of the town. "The net is set," Stilwell wrote in his diary. Stilwell's use of the Marauders as a maneuver element proved successful very fast. General Shinichi Tanaka, the commander of the Japanese 18th Division, ordered units of the 55th and 56th Regiments to advance south and destroy the Americans, posing a threat to his flanks after learning of the American unit behind his soldiers at Myitkyina, north of Walabum. As a result, the Marauders ran across Japanese units up to battalion strength as the net closed, and skirmishes occasionally turned into full-scale conflicts. Nonetheless, the Marauders had the upper hand because of their proficiency with unit maneuvers and their ability to adjust to the local terrain. Late on March 3rd, Lieutenant Logan Weston's INR platoon of the 3rd Battalion had detected Japanese moving in the vicinity after advancing west across the Nhpum River toward Nhpum Ga on the road north of Walabum. The unit moved to high ground and dug in early on the morning of the 4th. They were hit by mortar fire almost instantly and engaged by a larger Japanese unit, which resulted in multiple losses. Weston ordered his platoon to return to the east bank after the Japanese attack was lessened by mortar assistance from the 3rd Battalion soldiers remaining across the river. Another 3rd Battalion platoon, under by Lieutenant Victor Weingartner, took up position on the high ground above the east bank to offer cover as the INR platoon began the crossing under fire. They then opened fire on the Japanese soldiers who were pursuing them. To finish their pursuit, the Japanese troops dove into the river, but they were forced to give up after being killed by the Marauders' precise fire above them. Despite 2 of the wounded dying during the air evacuation later that day, the INR platoon managed to cross without suffering any more losses. In addition to saving the day that morning, the other Marauders' prompt assistance to the INR platoon paved the way for the subsequent mass murder of Japanese. The 3rd Battalion and its mortar crews, led by Lieutenant Colonel Charles E. Beach, had a commanding view of Walabum, the road north to Myitkyina, the site of the main Chinese attack, and the road south to Kamaying, the headquarters of the Japanese 18th Division, from the high terrain east of the Nambu River. The enemy used these roads to either gather reinforcements for fights north of Walabum or to prepare for a potential withdrawal. The Japanese command realized that they needed to drive out the invaders under mortar fire from the high ground. On March 6th, the 3rd Battalion's Orange Combat Team was attacked by members of the Japanese 56th Regiment. The Marauders were anticipating the attack and were firmly entrenched. The river in front of them and an open field on the other side gave them a perfect fire view of the German advance, giving them the advantage of higher ground. However, in order to destroy the enemy, the Japanese commander carried out 2 attacks, one early in the morning and the second late in the day. Both led to bloodshed. The Japanese soldiers' bravery as they repeatedly rushed to their deaths across the field and into the river astounded the Marauders. Merrill told Stilwell that 300 Japanese soldiers had been slain, although other versions claim that 400 were killed. Only 7 Marauders were injured by dusk. With minimal effort to move around the Marauders' flanks, the Japanese officers committed their soldiers to these fatal frontal attacks. Merrill ordered Beach's 3rd Battalion to leave in the stillness of the night. The Chinese had advanced on Walabum, which they would take the following day, with the help of a tank regiment accompanied by American advisors. Although the battle for Walabum had been decided, the Marauders had written the opening chapter of an incredible combat tale, but the fighting was far from ended. It was now time to travel further south along the route to Kamaying to the Mogong Valley. The Shaduzup Battle. As the Marauders advanced south into Shaduzup, Lieutenant Colonel William L. Osborne's 1st Battalion assumed command and once more served as a maneuver unit to support the main Chinese attack. On the Kaming-Mingquan route, the Chinese force was to attack at Jambubun, 25 kilometers before Shaduzup, after moving south from Walabum. In order to avoid the 1st Battalion and establish roadblocks nearer Myitkyina, the 2nd and 3rd Battalions were to swing farther south into the jungle. The 1st Battalion sought to be in place at Shaduzup by March 24th after the Marauders left the Walabum camp on March 12th. They had rested in the camp for 5 days, but an incident there would cost the Marauders more lives than all the fighting with the Japanese combined. They shared a campsite with the Chinese, who were untrained and uninformed about the significance of field sanitation. The Chinese forces, who were all peasants, excreted whenever and wherever the spirit took them, including in the river and streams, much to the displeasure of the Marauders. Halazone was used to purge the Marauders' water, but it was not enough to eradicate the bacteria the Chinese soldiers were bringing with them. In addition to the malaria they were already battling, the Marauders soon began to experience the first occurrences of amoebic dysentery. This would eventually spread throughout the battalions with disastrous results. For the first 2 days, the 1st Battalion led the way to Shaduzup and made rapid progress, but after that, they began to run into Japanese ambushes. When Osborne learned his men would have to battle their way down the route every day, they would not be able to reach their goal in time or be in a position to set up a successful blockage on the road south of Shaduzup. This was due to the growing enemy resistance. In order to reach the target date of March 24, he determined that the battalion needed to push cross-country around the Japanese. The amiable Kachin tribespeople acting as scouts and guides were a vital resource for the Marauders traversing jungle terrain without proper maps. The Kachins were very eager to aid the Yanks because many of them had been slain and tortured by the Japanese army. They were commended and the value of their contribution acknowledged by the Marauders and the OSS 101st Detachment stationed in North Burma. Still, it was brutally hard to make headway over tough, steeply sloping terrain through dense bamboo and jungle. The Marauders ran behind schedule even though units were rotated to use machetes to cut pathways. Fresh water and food were extremely scarce. They resumed the walk after receiving an airdrop of supplies on the 17th, but sickness was now rife across the regiment. In his journal, Stilwell wrote that he waited for news of the 1st BN, off on a new trail on March 22nd. The Japanese had been taken aback by the Marauders' rear-row presence during the 1st February movement and the battle for Walabum that followed. As the days went by and the battalion advanced further southwest through the forest toward the road south of Shaduzup, Japanese commanders now increased their flank security. As a result, it came into contact with more enemy troops and fought brief, intense firefights. As the main battalion units moved toward the road, Lieutenant Colonel Osborne came up with a strategy to trick the Japanese and relieve pressure. In order to divert their commander's focus from the Marauders' main advance, he dispatched a platoon led by Lieutenant John McElmurray to the northwest, away from the battalion, to fire on Japanese forces on the road above Shaduzup. The strategy was successful. After firing on and killing a Japanese soldier on the road, McElmurray's platoon attracted mortar fire from nearby enemy units. The route from Shaduzup to Kamaying, which ran west of the river and was seized by Japanese forces, paralleled the east bank of the Mogong River, where Osborne had his 1st Battalion on March 27th. Osborne devised a plan for his White Combat Team to begin crossing the river at 3 a.m. on the 28th and attack the Japanese camp after receiving a scouting report from 2 courageous members of the INR platoon who had crossed the river late in the day to map enemy positions. The unit was positioned on the west bank of the river at 4:30 a.m. Many Japanese soldiers were killed as the Marauders attacked and overran the sleeping soldiers, while the remainder fled into the bush. By setting up their blockade at first light, the Marauders successfully prevented any Japanese reinforcements from traveling north along the road to Shaduzup, which was now being attacked by the Chinese 22nd Division. The Japanese artillery had precise coordinates for the fixed location that the Marauders who had set up the roadblock were attempting to defend without any tactical advantage. Fire from artillery began in the morning and lasted all day. With their 77mm mountain guns and 75mm howitzers, the Japanese persisted in bombarding the roadblock and the remaining 1st Battalion that was buried on the east side of the Mogong River. There was no artillery for the Marauders to retaliate with. Later that night, the Marauders withdrew after sustaining the onslaught into the nighttime. The Chinese 113th Regiment, which had been pursuing the Marauders as backup, arrived the following morning, March 29th, with 4 howitzers and opened fire on the Japanese. The Chinese infantry then launched an assault. The Japanese were fleeing from Shaduzup to Jambu Bun. The Shaduzup War was over. The 1st Battalion had presented a very good self-report. Osborne thought that his men had killed about 300 Japanese soldiers. They suffered 8 fatalities and 35 injuries. During this time, the 2nd and 3rd Battalions, located much further south along the road to Kamaying, were also vigorously fighting the Japanese. The Inkong Ga Battle. Beginning on March 12th, the same day as the 1st Battalion, the Marauders' 2nd and 3rd Battalions took a broader arc, with the goal of emerging from the jungle at the village of Inkong Ga, which is approximately 15 miles south of Shaduzup. Merrill accompanied these forces, led not only by the Kachin scouts but also by 2 Westerners, Farr and Jack Gershom, a British-Burmese hunter who had spent years in Burma and knew the jungle tracks well, Irish missionary James Stewart. They stayed clear of Japanese troops by moving up a clearly marked slope that was far enough from the road. By March 20th, the 2 battalions had advanced past the stalled 1st Battalion, evaded Shaduzup, and taken up positions within a day's march of the road, and in Kongatong. Merrill chose to split his force here. While he sent McGee's 2nd Battalion and the khaki combat team of the 3rd Battalion on their way to establish a roadblock south of Kongatong under Colonel Hunter's command, he would stay behind at Janpon with the Orange Combat Team of the 3rd Battalion and the OSS 101st Detachment of 300 Kachins, who had been there on their arrival. Merrill's strategy for dividing his forces was mirrored in Stilwell's notebook entry from March 22nd. M says his movements will look cockeyed, but never mind. Regardless of the strategy, Merrill was undoubtedly pushing the Marauders' 2nd and 3rd Battalions farther out on a limb with this prolonged movement without assistance, while the 1st Battalion was fully engaged at Shaduzup. He is bluffing, Kamaying, and passing at night. Located far behind enemy lines, the Marauders were dispersed over a 30 to 40 mile radius. That same day, with the 2nd Battalion's Blue Combat Team in the lead, Colonel Hunter led his forces south. On the first night, they set up camp in the settlement of Nhpum Ga. The following day, the 21st, Hunter moved into Aocha, set up a resupply, and got radio orders from Merrill to advance quickly, because the Japanese were pulling back in front of the Chinese at Jambuban. Hunter's Marauder detachment retreated into the valley on the 22nd, heading toward the road that the main Japanese units took. In a grueling exercise, they had to leave the ridgeline, hike down a steep jungle track, and then follow a tiny river from one steep bank to the other. Late in the day, the forces finally came to level ground, close to the town of Nphum. After setting up a resupply drop, Hunter instructed McGee to lead the khaki combat team and the 2nd Battalion in pushing 5 more miles to Shiraw. After walking until 11 p.m., the Marauders set up camp. It was pouring rain. Hunter gave McGee the order to proceed with the roadblock setup 6 miles south of Inkong Ga the following morning. He stayed in Shiraw in reserve with the Orange Combat Team of the 3rd Battalion. The 2nd Battalion moved across to the west bank of the Mogang River, with the blue and green INR platoons leading the charge. The khaki combat team remained on the east bank of the river, armed with mules and mortars. Between 4 and 5 p.m., the 2 INR platoons independently came into contact with Japanese units close to the road, and both started firing. After that, the INR teams left to join their combat units, who were buried about 300 yards from the road on the west side of the Mogang. Stilwell's general onslaught left the 2nd Battalion rather isolated. The 2nd Battalion was the only unit to catch the Japanese command's notice as a threat to their soldiers on the road above their headquarters at Kamaying, as the 1st Battalion had not yet begun its assault near Shaduzup to the north. The Marauders could hear trucks approaching on the road ahead of them, and Japanese soldiers loudly conversing as they unloaded, as they were in their nighttime position, close to Inkong Ga. In the early hours of March 24th, they anticipated an attack by the Japanese. However, there was no attack when daybreak arrived, and the Marauders sat in their posts while the rain continued. Lieutenant Ted McLogan led a unit forward, which quickly came across a Japanese patrol and opened fire on it. McLogan's troops dispersed the initial group of enemy soldiers and then proceeded to patrol the route, where they discovered another group and engaged them in combat. McLogan promptly returned to the battalion position, once McGee called him on the radio, gave him the status report, and instructed him to do so. Then the Japanese began attacking. After a mortar barrage, Japanese soldiers erupted in a banzai charge, yelling, "From the elephant grass to the front of the Marauders." The raid failed, and these soldiers were killed by automatic weapons fire. Shortly after, another banzai attack was launched, this time over an open field in a different area of the perimeter. The front of the Marauders' position was now covered in Japanese corpses, to the point where they had to be pushed aside to preserve fire fields when this attack was also mowed down. The Marauders later remarked on the Japanese forces' fervent bravery and tenacity. But one Marauder also pointed out that the Japanese Imperial Army frequently used amphetamines before battle, saying, "They must have been doped up." Although it occasionally slowed, the mortar fire on the Marauders' position persisted. The Japanese launched numerous attacks throughout the day, moving their sites of assault around the perimeter of the 2nd Battalion in an attempt to find a weak point. The Japanese never actually massed their forces. Instead, they merely attacked in groups of 10 to 40 men at a time. The afternoon was filled with more banzai strikes. Due to radio issues, McGee was unable to communicate with Colonel Hunter. He informed Merrill that his unit was running low on ammunition and that they were to retire to the east bank of the Mogang River and join the 3rd Battalion's khaki combat team. The 2nd Battalion retreated over the Mogang in the late afternoon, aided by a mortar bombardment by the khaki combat team and a P-51 air raid on the Japanese positions. They were able to rest for barely a few hours despite being utterly fatigued, having fought off 16 banzai raids, and having slain an estimated 200 Japanese. McGee received a radio message from Brig General Merrill informing him that additional Japanese troops were approaching and that they should leave. They left the Mogang River site at 5 a.m. on March 25th and retraced their journey to the town of Sharaw, where Hunter was camping despite a deluge of rain. Hunter was initially ignorant of the scope of the 2nd Battalion's action since he had lost contact with McGee. He objected to Merrill's order for McGee to retreat after learning about it. When he encountered McGee at Sharaw, he declared that he would carry on drawing back per Merrill's directive. On March 26th, McGee led his soldiers back toward Och and the north-south ridgeline that the Marauders had followed a week earlier, aware that Japanese forces would be pursuing them. Following with the 3rd Battalion was Colonel Hunter, who still opposed the withdrawal but felt compelled to comply with Merrill's orders. Hunter believed that, rather of retreating, the Marauders ought to have attacked. He questioned whether there were more Japanese soldiers present and believed they were passing up the chance to attack the Japanese headquarters at Kamesing, which was more to the south and was in a weaker position. He asked Merrill by radio if he might attack with the 3rd Battalion, but he was told to leave. Merrill was right to be cautious in this case, and Hunter was wrong. The detachment that followed the 2nd Battalion up from Inkong Ga was not the only Japanese force encircling the Marauders. Earlier, Lieutenant Colder Beach, the commander of the 3rd Battalion, had shown good sense by sending 2 platoon patrols to build up blocks to cover the 2nd Battalion's flanks as it retreated to Och and then to Sharaw. A rifle platoon of the Orange Combat Team, commanded by Lieutenant Warren Smith, had established a block on the Warong Road, while the INR platoon, commanded by Lieutenant Logan Weston, had established a block at Pokum, 7 miles north of Kamesing. When a Japanese patrol showed up on March 24th, the INR unit was there. They all were killed when the unit opened fire. When a second Japanese patrol with scout dogs arrived, they were also destroyed. Despite being hit by mortar fire, the Marauders held their ground and blocked the trail all night. The following morning, Weston chose to withdraw his platoon back up the trail after receiving more severe mortar fire and indications of a flanking movement. He came across Lieutenant Smith's platoon, which shared ammunition with them, and, after contacting Merrill, got the go-ahead for both platoons to withdraw along the trail. They would take turns defending one another from Japanese flanking movements and preventing the Japanese from moving against the withdrawal of the 2nd and 3rd Battalion. To deceive the Japanese, they left a few tiny campfires glowing when they departed in the dark on March 26th. After digging in farther up the route a few hours later, they heard gunfire as the Japanese attacked the camp they had left behind and opened fire on their own troops. Lieutenant Smith and his unit killed 28 Japanese when they attacked another force that was approaching them that morning. In order to prevent Japanese encirclement, Weston and Smith decided to pull out completely that afternoon. They retreated all the way back to Aoche, where they built defensive positions and awaited the arrival of the 2nd and 3rd Battalions from Manpin. These inferior officers' initiative and their masterfully coordinated maneuvers and tactics had likely saved many lives by delaying the massive Japanese force that was determined to catch the Marauders' battalions on the trail. But now the Marauders faced a unit that excelled in mobility and fire, potentially the campaign's pivotal battle, an epic defensive battle. The Nhpum Ga battle. Merrill had moved swiftly and dispersed his forces along a vast network of trails behind the Japanese lines ever since the Marauders broke into the jungle from Stilwell's headquarters on February 24th. This had surprised and killed hundreds of enemy soldiers. To offset the threat from behind, the Japanese commander responded by withdrawing battalions from his front lines. Now, stronger Japanese troops and their artillery were to catch the unsupported Marauder battalions well to the south of the main Chinese onslaught and the 1st Battalion action at Shaduzup. The trail from Ochi led 4 miles north to the village of Nphum Ga. On March 27th, Merrill's headquarters was located there when Lieutenant Colonel McGee's 2nd Battalion invaded Oche, followed a few hours later by Colonel Hunter and the 3rd Battalion. Merrill gave the order for the 3rd Battalion to advance 4 miles to Hamxingyang, which is 1,500 feet lower in elevation, after pushing through Nhpum Ga, a high point on the path. An airport in the broad valley next to Hamxingyang would be ideal. The Japanese harassed the 2nd Battalion as they began their march from Aoche to Nhpum Ga on the 28th. On the track, a number of machine gun teams established stay-behind positions to delay the Japanese battalions and ambush Japanese scouts. Later, the Japanese targeted the 2nd Battalion's march line with artillery fire. In order to defend the hilltop from an attack, the battalion began preparing defensive positions after closing on Nphum Ga by the afternoon. However, a significant setback occurred. Merrill suffered from a heart attack. The following day he was evacuated after being transferred to Ham Xingyang with the 3rd Battalion. Colonel Hunter was now in charge of the Marauders. Japanese forces advanced and encircled McGee's 2nd Battalion's positions at Nphum Ga over the day and evening. The Marauders were now in the midst of the bloodiest battle they would face in Burma. The Marauders had the benefit of having more machine guns and automatic weaponry than the typical infantry unit allotment, including Thompson submachine guns, M1 carbines, and bars. For the next 12 days, they required all of their weaponry. On the 29th, the 2nd Battalion's 900 men, who included communications, medics, and mule skinners, continued to excavate the hilltop position in anticipation of the Japanese attack. The east-west axis was shorter than the north-south axis, which measured about 400 yards. Within the perimeter was a water hole. Hunter came to see how things were set up and set up quick food and ammunition airdrops. Hunter radioed the 1st Battalion, then withdrew from Shaduzup, and gave Osborne the order to begin moving toward Ham Xingyang after promising McGee that there would be active patrols on the trails between the two villages to prevent Japanese flanking moves. The first of many banzai raids against the Marauders' positions at Nhpum Ga was carried out by the Japanese at morning on March 30th. This established the tone for the next 12 days and came after a bombardment of artillery and mortar. With only brief pauses, the Japanese artillery bombarded the Marauders' positions. The mortar fire never stopped. Throughout the siege, the decaying bodies of the early casualties, horses and mules, would remain in the open. Throughout the perimeter, the men repelled banzai strikes at several locations. The water well was taken by the Japanese in an early onslaught. The guys, trapped in their foxholes, relieved themselves by tossing the contents of their helmets outside when they could. While attempting to retreat to the perimeter, 2 Marauders who were scouting Japanese positions were killed by friendly fire. The 2nd Battalion deployed patrols south back toward Nhpum Ga and attempted to attack north along the trail toward the 3rd Battalion. However, overwhelming Japanese fire from set positions forced both patrols to retreat. At Nhpum Ga, the Marauders were surrounded. When the day was over, McGee informed Hunter that he had 9 wounded and 3 dead. The Marauders, who were now running low on water, were able to collect some rainwater in their ponchos on April 1st, thanks to the heavy rains. Hunter gave McGee the excellent news that 2 75mm howitzers would be delivered to Ham Xingyang the following day to help the forces at Nhpum Ga, and there were no attacks on the settlement. The Japanese defeated the 3rd Battalion's Orange Combat Team after they launched an offensive up the trail toward the 2nd Battalion's defensive positions. The Japanese attacked Nhpum Ga once more on April 2nd. Once more, the pattern was a succession of attacks on various locations around the perimeter, backed by mortar and artillery fire. Everyone felt disgusted. The 2nd Battalion received a vital air delivery of ammunition and supplies during a pause in the combat in the middle of the day, but they were badly short on water. Japanese artillery shelled continuously on April 3rd. Any infantryman who has experienced such a situation can attest to the fear that the sound of shells and their trembling explosions can evoke as he cowers in his insufficient foxhole. In order to treat the injured, a medic and 2 doctors had to crawl from foxhole to foxhole while coming under sniper fire. The 2nd Battalion lost 6 men to death and 12 injured that day. They required the assistance of the 3rd Battalion. The following day, the 3rd Battalion took over the main battle and attempted to advance to the position of the 2nd Battalion. The 2 combat squads of the 3rd Battalion made an effort to penetrate in the afternoon. With the 2 75mm howitzers that had been parachuted in earlier, the Orange Combat Team launched an attack directly up the trail, firing point-blank in support. In an attempt to get around the Japanese blocking force, the khaki combat teams swung into the dense jungle. The fighters were frequently fewer than 30 yards apart when firing at one another due to the deep jungle and the Japanese soldiers' camouflage positions. As the Marauders and the Japanese attempted to turn each other's flanks, the troops of the 2nd Battalion, still under artillery fire, could hear the thunder of the combat along the trail and off to the sides in the forest. The 3rd Battalion was still a mile distant, but they were getting closer. Colonel Hunter radioed the 1st Battalion to get to their help as soon as possible. The Japanese launched a second round of attacks on the 2nd Battalion positions around dusk, this time redistributing their assaults over the perimeter. Now, several of the Marauders were so sick with sickness or dysentery that they were unable to endure it. Because the lines were so close together, Staff Sergeant Roy Matsumoto, one of the 2nd Battalion's Nisei translators, was able to warn the targeted area after overhearing the Japanese discussing their impending attacks. They repelled the attacks. McGee texted Hunter, saying, "Please hurry," even though the Marauders had made it through the day. Stilwell's chronicles made no reference to the Marauders' efforts at this time of intense engagement. Stilwell's time was consumed by meetings in China and later India. It wasn't until late on April 3rd that he returned to his Burmese headquarters. He cites a disturbing MSG in his first diary entry about the Marauders, dated April 4th, from Hunter the night before. The 3rd Battalion Force's attempt to relieve the Marauders at Nhpum Ga was the main focus of the battle on April 5th. Since the Japanese troops obstructing their rescue attempt were dug in, the 3rd Battalion troops had to expose themselves in the attack, putting them in a tactically opposite position to their 2nd Battalion comrades. Once more, the action took place at close quarters in the dense jungle, with only 20 to 30 yards separating the opposing forces. The gunfire was fierce. The 3rd Battalion had only made 300 yards of progress by the end of the day. Once more, Staff Sergeant Roy Matsumoto stood out on the hilltop at Nhpum Ga. He crawled into the bush from the defense perimeter and overheard Japanese troops talking about the attack on his sector of the defense line the next morning. Lieutenant Colonel McGee was able to redirect personnel to that side of the perimeter with this knowledge, and the attack was successfully repelled when it occurred early on April 6th. On Nhpum Ga, the rest of the day was calm, and the Marauders were fortunate to receive a resupply drop that contained their much-needed water. The 3rd Battalion proceeded to advance up the hill toward the beleaguered 2nd Battalion on Nhpum Ga, after receiving a round from their 2 supporting artillery pieces. By the end of the day, they had advanced within 500 meters of their perimeter. On Good Friday, April 7th, the lines remained stationary, but a more significant event took place. The 1st Battalion reached Hamxingyang at the end of the day, following 5 days of a forced march. They were 800 strong, but they were in terrible shape since they had not eaten much while they were trying to help their brethren. Many had cut holes in the seats of their pants to allow them to march without stopping, because they were so sick with diarrhea and malaria. On April 8th, plans were formed to launch a flanking attack using a carefully selected group of around 250 of their most resilient survivors. The khaki combat team's INR platoon once again led the frontal assault on the 8th. It sustained 9 casualties while moving slowly. Just a few hundred meters short of Nhpum Ga, the 2 howitzers were rebuilt within 700 meters of the Japanese after being transported up the trail on mules. Nearly point blank, the crews fired more than 100 rounds into the hostile positions. At twilight, the 1st Battalion team turned toward the hill after a lengthy flanking movement to the west of the Japanese lines. They could smell the stink of the dead and hear gunfire from above. Several trails were blocked, including the one that led back to the Japanese resupply depot at Kari. After that, the unit set up camp for the night. Throughout the day, the 3rd Battalion had failed to breach the Japanese defenses despite heavy shelling, but the 2nd Battalion troops were still buried and clinging. When Easter Sunday dawned, Lieutenant Colonel McGee sent out a patrol since the Japanese were not shooting on the 2nd Battalion. One Japanese soldier they came upon was shot. A patrol from the 3rd Battalion advanced up the hill, trailed by a mortar and artillery barrage, across a broken terrain strewn with Japanese corpses, some of which were stacked like cordwood, according to one observer. A Japanese machine gun position was encountered by an Orange Combat Team patrol. They killed one marauder before continuing. Later, Collis McGee was able to note in his diary that the 3rd Battalion's relief troops had arrived at midday. In addition to the beating they had received in the preceding days, the 1st Battalion's flanking operation was likely the reason why the remaining Japanese had withdrawn. Nhpum Ga's 12-day siege had over. The carnage and the stink of the carcasses covered in blowflies and maggots, including numerous horses and mules, nauseated the troops who had rushed to the 2nd Battalion's rescue. There were 400 Japanese killed. With the exception of those nearly totally incapacitated by illness, the Marauders suffered 57 fatalities and 302 injuries. Many of the survivors of the 2nd Battalion were still sitting in their foxholes in a trance, suffering from shell shock. Along with the burial grounds for the 1st and 3rd Battalions, the bodies of the 2nd Battalion, who had buried them on the hilltop, were unearthed and ceremoniously reinterred in more appropriate ground at Hamxingyang. The 3 Marauder battalions had run out of troops and were weary. They were eventually able to relax at Hamxingyang. Resupplies of new uniforms, food, ammunition, medical supplies, and mail were brought in, while the injured and ill were flown out of the crowded makeshift airfield. Only about 1,600 of the 2,600 troops who had embarked on the Ledo Road March into Burma in February were still ready for duty. Although the Marauders had won every battle, they had suffered a heavy cost, with many people killed, injured, or crippled by illness. Stilwell's notebook entry from Monday, April 10th stated, Nphum Ga has been cleaned up. On April 11th, he improved his remarks to, hard fight at Nhpum Ga. Good job cleaning out the Japanese and hooking up. That's a very mild compliment. Despite being emotionally and physically exhausted, the Marauders slept with the assurance that their goal had been accomplished. Most Marauders were still thinking about the earlier pledges of 90 days of dangerous and hazardous combat action, followed by return to the United States. To a man, they believed that their respite had finally arrived. When they learned that there would be no respite from fighting and that they would instead have to march on to Myitkyina, they were extremely dissatisfied and incensed. At the end of the war, many of the Marauders harbored animosity toward Stilwell, whom they rightly blamed. They faced Myitkyina, their last obstacle. It was a carnage. The Marauders lost 980 men to illness and disease, 955 were wounded, and 272 were killed during their last mission against the Japanese base at Myitkyina. Approximately 200 of the 2,600 Marauders who survived the fall of Myitkyina responded to the roll call. Only 130 exhausted combat-effective commanders and men remained when the 5307th was dissolved on August 10, 1944, 1 week after Chinese and American forces had taken control of the town. Although Merrill's Marauders are remembered as a superb combat squad, fame and glory have rarely come at such a great cost.